On a dark, stormy night, a young boy with nothing to his name stumbles upon a stranger lying helpless in the cold rain. Despite the fear and danger, he puts his own life at risk to save the man. What starts as a desperate act of kindness turns into a life-changing moment for both of them. Stay with us to see how this powerful story of hope and courage unfolds. Welcome to Graceful Storyteller, where every story brings hope and love. The city was drowning under the weight of a relentless storm. Rain pounded the streets with a fury, creating rivers that flowed through the cracks in the pavement. Thunder growled ominously, and streaks of lightning split the sky into jagged pieces. Amid this chaos, a boy named Ethan huddled under the fragile awning of an old, abandoned shop. At just 14 years old, Ethan had already faced a lifetime of struggles. His thin jacket was no match for the biting cold, and his soaked clothes clung to his shivering frame. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, a constant companion in his lonely world. He pulled his knees to his chest, trying to shield himself from the freezing wind that seemed to pierce through to his very bones. As the storm raged on, drowning the city in noise and darkness, Ethan closed his eyes, willing the world to disappear, even if just for a moment. But then, a sound broke through the relentless rain, a faint cry, sharp and desperate. Ethan froze, his ears straining to catch the noise again. It came once more, this time louder, more urgent. He glanced toward the source, an alley across the street, shrouded in shadow. Fear gripped him. The alley looked ominous, a place where danger could easily lurk. Every instinct screamed at him to stay where he was, to keep out of trouble. Yet, something about that voice pierced through his fear. It wasn't just a cry, it was a plea, a desperate call for help. Ethan's heart raced as he stood, the cold rain immediately drenching him once again. Hesitating for only a moment, he stepped out from under the awning and into the storm, drawn by a force he couldn't ignore. Ethan approached the alley cautiously, each step feeling heavier as the shadows swallowed him whole. The dim light of a distant street lamp barely illuminated the narrow passage, leaving most of it shrouded in darkness. The rain seemed louder here, its relentless drumming against metal dumpsters and puddles echoing in the confined space. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he strained to see through the gloom. And then he saw him. Lying on the wet, cold ground was an elderly man, crumpled in a heap. His face was pale, his clothes soaked and clinging to his fragile frame. He clutched his chest with trembling hands, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. For a moment, Ethan froze. Fear rooted him to the spot as his mind raced. What if this was some kind of trap? What if someone was waiting in the shadows to pounce the moment he let his guard down? But then the man groaned, a low, anguished sound that shattered Ethan's hesitation. He stepped closer, kneeling beside the man, despite the freezing water soaking through his jeans. Sir Ethan called out, his voice trembling. "Are you okay?" The man's head turned slightly, his eyes fluttering open. Pain etched every line on his face as he tried to speak. "Help me," he whispered, his voice so faint that Ethan had to lean in to hear him. Ethan's throat tightened. He was just a kid, how could he possibly help someone in this condition? His mind screamed at him to leave, to find someone else who could do something. But the man's fragile state, the desperation in his weak voice, pinned Ethan in place. He couldn't walk away. "I'm here," Ethan said, his voice steadier now. "What's your name?" The man struggled to respond, his breath hitching. "Walter," he managed to say between shallow gasps. Ethan nodded, his mind racing for what to do next. He glanced around the alley, hoping to spot someone who could help. But it was empty, just him, Walter, and the storm. Walter's breathing grew more labored, each gasp sounding like it might be his last. Ethan's pulse raced as panic clawed at his chest. He had no phone, no way to call for help. What could he possibly do? Then he remembered the man's jacket. "Do you have a phone?" Ethan asked urgently, his voice trembling. Walter's weak hand gestured toward his pocket. Without hesitation, Ethan fumbled through the soaked fabric, his cold fingers shaking as he searched. Finally, he found the phone, its screen cracked but still functional. A surge of relief coursed through him as he unlocked it. His fingers hovered over the keypad for a moment before he dialed 911, his voice cracking as the operator answered. "There's a man in an alley off 3rd and Main," Ethan said, his words tumbling over each other in his haste. "I think he's having a heart attack. He can't breathe. Please, send someone fast." The operator's calm voice reassured him that help was on the way. Ethan hung up, clutching the phone tightly as he turned back to Walter. "They're coming," he said, his voice steadier now. "Just hold on a little longer." Walter's lips twitched into the faintest of smiles. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice weak but filled with sincerity. "Not many would have stopped." Ethan looked away, his face flushing with a mix of emotions he couldn't quite name. He wasn't used to gratitude. "It's nothing," he muttered. "I just couldn't leave you here." Walter's eyelids fluttered, his strength fading with each passing moment. "You're a good kid," he said softly, his words slurred. Don't. Leave me. I won't, Ethan promised, though his heart ached with uncertainty. Rain continued to pour, soaking them both to the core. The cold seemed to seep into Ethan's very bones, but he stayed rooted to the spot, holding Walter's hand to keep him grounded. Minutes felt like hours as the storm raged on, and Ethan's fear grew with each shallow breath Walter took. He glanced toward the street, willing the ambulance to appear, but the road remained empty. Where are they? Ethan whispered to himself, his voice barely audible over the rain. Finally, the distant wail of a siren pierced the night. Ethan's head shot up, his heart leaping with relief as red and blue lights illuminated the end of the alley. They're here, he said, squeezing Walter's hand. Just hold on a little longer. The ambulance screeched to a halt at the mouth of the alley, its flashing lights cutting through the storm. 2 paramedics jumped out, their movements swift and purposeful as they wheeled a stretcher toward Ethan and Walter. The sight of them filled Ethan with a mix of relief and renewed anxiety. He stepped back slightly, letting them take over. What do we have here? One of the paramedics asked, kneeling beside Walter and quickly assessing his condition. He said it's his heart, Ethan stammered, his voice shaky. I found him here. I called you as soon as I could. The paramedics worked efficiently, checking Walter's pulse and blood pressure. He's in rough shape, one of them said to the other. We need to get him to the hospital immediately. They carefully lifted Walter onto the stretcher, his body limp but still clinging to consciousness. As they began to wheel him toward the ambulance, Walter suddenly reached out, his hand grabbing one of the paramedics by the arm with surprising strength. Wait, Walter croaked, his voice hoarse but filled with urgency. The boy. He has to come with me. The paramedic paused, glancing at Ethan, who stood frozen in the rain. Are you family? The paramedic asked, looking between the two of them. Ethan hesitated, unsure how to respond. He wasn't family, not to Walter or anyone else. For a moment he thought about stepping back, disappearing into the shadows of the alley, as if none of this had ever happened. But then Walter's eyes locked onto his, pleading. Don't leave me, Walter said, his voice trembling. Please. Ethan swallowed hard. I'll come, he said finally, his voice barely audible. The paramedic nodded and motioned for Ethan to climb into the back of the ambulance. As the vehicle doors shut behind them, Ethan found himself sitting next to Walter, who reached out and grabbed his hand. For a moment, Ethan hesitated, then wrapped his fingers around Walter's frail, trembling hand. Thank you, Walter murmured, his voice weak but sincere. I don't think I would have made it without you. The ambulance lurched forward, weaving through the rain-soaked streets. Ethan stared out the window at the city lights flashing past, his mind a swirl of emotions. He had no idea why Walter wanted him to stay, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he mattered to someone. The ambulance screeched to a halt at the hospital entrance, and the paramedics rushed Walter inside. Ethan followed hesitantly, unsure of what to expect. The bright lights of the hospital lobby and the hurried voices of doctors and nurses overwhelmed his senses. He stood frozen, unsure if he should stay or slip away into the night. But then Walter's weak voice called out to him. Ethan. Don't leave, he said, as he was wheeled toward an emergency room. Ethan felt a pull he couldn't explain. He nodded and followed the stretcher, ignoring the curious glances from hospital staff. In the chaos of machines beeping and medical jargon flying, Walter clung to Ethan's presence like a lifeline. For hours, Ethan waited outside the examination room, sitting on a cold bench. The storm continued to rage outside, but the world inside the hospital was strangely still. Ethan's clothes were still damp, and the chill seeped into his bones, but he didn't care. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling as questions swirled in his mind. Who was Walter? Why had he asked Ethan to stay? And why couldn't Ethan bring himself to leave? A nurse eventually stepped out and smiled kindly at Ethan. You can see him now, she said, gesturing toward the room. Ethan walked in cautiously. Walter lay in a hospital bed, hooked up to monitors that beeped softly. He looked tired but smiled faintly when he saw Ethan. You stayed, Walter said, his voice barely above a whisper. Of course, Ethan replied, moving closer to the bed. I said I wouldn't leave. Walter nodded slowly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, with some effort, Walter said, You remind me of someone. My son. Ethan blinked, startled. Your son, he asked, his voice soft. Walter's eyes grew misty as he stared at the ceiling. I lost him. Years ago. He was about your age. Since then, I've been alone. No family, no one to turn to. His voice broke slightly, and he turned his head to look at Ethan. But tonight, when you found me, I didn't feel so alone anymore. Ethan felt a lump in his throat. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he nodded, his heart aching with a strange mix of sadness and connection. I don't have anyone either, Ethan admitted after a long pause. His voice was barely audible. No parents, No family. It's just me. Walter reached out weakly, his trembling hand finding Ethan's. No one should have to go through life alone, he said. Not you. Not me. For the first time in years, Ethan felt truly seen. The walls he had built around himself began to crumble, and he let himself believe, just for a moment, that maybe he didn't have to face the world on his own. The minutes stretched into hours as Ethan sat by Walter's side. The storm outside began to quiet, but inside the hospital room, the weight of unspoken words lingered. Walter lay back on the bed, his breathing more even now, but his eyes carried a heaviness that Ethan couldn't ignore. Ethan, Walter said suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice was weak but firm. Ethan looked up from the chair he had slumped into, his gaze meeting Walter's. Yeah, he asked hesitantly. Walter took a moment, his hand trembling slightly as he adjusted the blanket covering him. I don't want you to go back to the streets, he said, his tone filled with quiet determination. I want you to stay with me. Ethan blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. What he asked, his voice almost a whisper. Walter turned his head to look at him directly. I know it sounds strange, he said, his voice soft but unwavering. But tonight, I feel like fate brought us together. You saved my life, Ethan, and I want to give you something in return, a home, a chance at something better. Ethan's heart raced. He opened his mouth to respond but couldn't find the words. No one had ever made an offer like this to him before. Most people avoided him, looked through him, or treated him like he didn't exist. Why would you do that for me, Ethan finally asked, his voice cracking under the weight of his emotions. Walter smiled faintly, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Because I see something in you, he said. Something special. The world hasn't been kind to you, I can tell. But you stopped for me tonight, even when you didn't have to. That kind of kindness is rare, and I don't want you to waste it surviving on the streets. Ethan looked away, his hands gripping the sides of the chair tightly. Doubt swirled in his mind. What if it didn't work out? What if he disappointed Walter? What if I'm not what you expect, he asked, his voice barely audible. Walter shook his head, his gaze steady. It's not about what I expect, he said. It's about giving you a chance. A chance to be safe, to grow, to figure out who you are. We'll figure it out together. I promise. Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. He wanted to believe Walter, to trust in the possibility of a better life. But years of disappointment and rejection made it hard. I don't know, he started, his voice trailing off. You don't have to decide now, Walter said gently. But I want you to know, no matter what you choose, you're not alone anymore. Not as long as I'm here. For the first time in years, Ethan felt a spark of hope flicker in his chest. He nodded slowly, his lips trembling as he whispered, Thank you. Walter reached out his hand, and after a brief hesitation, Ethan took it. In that simple gesture, a connection was forged, one that neither of them could have imagined when the night began. Morning light filtered through the hospital room curtains, soft and warm after the stormy night. Ethan stirred in the chair beside Walter's bed, his head resting awkwardly on his arm. For the first time in what felt like forever, he had slept without fear of waking up to danger. Walter was awake, his expression peaceful as he watched the boy sleep. When Ethan finally opened his eyes, he sat up quickly, rubbing his neck as he glanced at Walter. Good morning, Walter said with a faint smile. His voice was stronger now, less strained. Morning, Ethan mumbled, sitting back in the chair. He looked at the sunlight spilling across the floor and realized the storm was over. For the first time in a long time, he felt like the chaos in his life might finally be settling too. A soft knock at the door broke the moment, and a man in a neatly pressed suit entered the room. He carried a briefcase and had a kind but serious expression. Mr. Walter Harris, the man asked, glancing between Walter and Ethan. Walter nodded. Yes, that's me, he said. And this is Ethan. The man offered Ethan a polite smile. I'm Mr. Carter, your lawyer, he said, turning back to Walter. I understand you've had quite the night. Are you feeling well enough to discuss your plans? Walter nodded slowly. Yes, he said. He turned to Ethan, his gaze soft. I've made my decision, and I want Ethan to know. Ethan shifted nervously in his chair. What decision, he asked cautiously. Walter gestured for Mr. Carter to proceed. The lawyer opened his briefcase, pulling out a few papers. Mr. Harris has decided to revise his will and designate legal provisions for you, Ethan, he explained. This includes guardianship if you agree to stay with him. Ethan's eyes widened. Wait, you mean, you want me to stay with you? Like for real? Walter chuckled softly. Yes, for real, he said. I don't want you going back to the streets. You've been given so little in life, Ethan. It's time someone gave you more. Emotion surged in Ethan's chest, a mix of disbelief, gratitude, and fear. But why me, he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Because you're worth it, Walter said simply. Because I see potential in you that the world hasn't had the chance to see yet. And because we both deserve a second chance. Tears welled in Ethan's eyes, but he quickly wiped them away. He nodded slowly, his voice thick as he said, "Okay, I'll stay." Walter smiled, visibly relieved. "Thank you, Ethan, for everything." That morning marked the beginning of a new chapter for both of them. Ethan had spent years surviving alone, but now, for the first time, he had someone to lean on. Walter, who had lost so much, found hope and purpose in helping Ethan rebuild his life. Together, they were no longer two lost souls drifting through the world, they were a family. As they left the hospital days later, the sun was shining brightly, and the world felt full of possibilities. Ethan carried a small duffel bag Walter had bought him, and Walter walked beside him with a newfound strength. Sometimes it's in the darkest storms that we find the brightest connections. One act of kindness can change a life, and in this case, it changed two. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Stay tuned for more stories of courage, hope, and unexpected bonds.